Well, certainly that's a Sector C organization because what they're doing is aggregating the supply. It's cooperatively owned, so the farmers who provide their dairy products to Organic Valley are the owners of Organic Valley. It's a co-op, and that's where they're aggregating and sending their supply out to institutional outlets. So they're a Sector C enterprise. And I think what we're going to see over the next 10 years is increasing numbers of these cooperative and probably privately owned ventures that are aggregating and distributing supplies of locally produced products. So that's a great example. Now, one of the tricks with Organic Valley is how far away does Organic Valley products travel? When does Organic Valley stop being local? When it gets to California? When it gets to Texas? Just how far does it travel before it stops being a local product? And that's one of those questions that the local foods movement is kind of grappling with. So this definition of local is a little bit in flux. What do we really mean when we say local? Is a milk produced on a small family farm from Oregon, or a cheese? There's this really good cheese I like to buy. If it's here, is it local, or it traveled halfway across the country? What does that mean? Does it only fit a few of those criteria that mean good food and not others? So it'll be interesting to see what the local foods movement does to make sense of that.
Maggie, if I could just add a comment about Organic Valley and the question of miles, they actually strive to keep their milk, for instance. I can't speak for their processed foods like cottage cheese or sour cream, but for their milk, if you're buying milk that's Organic Valley here, it's been produced in this region and it has its own designated carton. If you buy Organic Valley milk when you're in California or Oregon, it has its own regionally specific carton, and that milk that you buy in California under the Organic Valley label has come from a western region, and the same for the Northeast. So they are, despite them being in what you call Sector C and being bigger than any of us ever think of when we think about local, they actually are striving to keep the local within their mission and in action.
But the economics of the situation with just simply shipping, the tremendous uptick now with the cost of fuel, you better keep it local. Because if you're going to drive it across the country, it's going to drive the price up, but you aren't going to sell it.
And so that's one of the exciting things about making the case for local foods is now that I should have bought gas in Coates on the way down because it was $3.34. I didn't know that.
Stop by Rochester on your way back.
And stop by in Rochester, and then I stopped in Cannon Falls, and it was $3.45, and I went, but I couldn't drive farther to see if it would get cheaper. I really needed to fill up. So that issue that people are talking about with the cost of fossil fuels is actually contributing to local, this interest in local foods and this question not only about carbon footprint, but food prices, which, as you know, are causing riots, and people are very concerned about it worldwide right now. So what are the needs that we're seeing in Minnesota? Well, just in brief, people are saying, people can't afford to buy farmland right now. We've got to figure this one out. The property tax prices will put a lot of small operators out of business. Zoning regulations can be a problem for smaller local foods producers, and we really need some technical assistance to help these folks get off the ground and produce our food. Finally, as I mentioned, we're going to need to address this infrastructure issue. I read an essay by this woman. I was all excited because it was talking about local foods as a feminist issue, and I thought that sounded pretty good. And then I read the essay, and she said, okay, I've got 3 kids. I work full-time, and I'm supposed to stop at 7 places every day after work and, cook this meal from scratch and stop 7 places to get my food on top of it. And I thought it would be the other thing about go local foods, girl power. And I was surprised at her critique. But I think what people are going to start to explore is how is it that people can get access to local foods that makes it more convenient in terms of time, addresses some of the mileage questions that you just raised, and keeps it consistent and reliable year-round. Finally, what we're finding is an awful lot of red tape for places like schools who are really looking for ways to give kids better food. And not just keep out the crud, but put in the good local stuff that puts money into the coffers of local producers. And we really need to address both some of the nutritional red tape around that, and not just that ketchup's a vegetable, but how much protein and fat a kid can have. And then also the kinds of budgets they have. And then a lot of these kitchens aren't set up to cook. So if we have an apple producer who wants to sell apples to their local school, if they can't cut it and bag it and get it to the school can't do anything with it. Or if there's a truckload of local potatoes, there's no one in that kitchen to prep them. If they're not frozen and shaped like a pre-seasoned French fry that's already deep fried in a trans fat, the school can't do anything about that. So there's some real systems level issues that we're going to have to address to make sure that our schools and places like hospitals too, institutions can really begin to feature local foods. A lot of folks are saying, you know, all this local food stuff is great, but look at all these young families. They don't know how to cook anymore. They grew up operating a microwave. You know, if it's got a keypad, they can do it. But what folks are saying is, you know, we have to dial back and build back these life skills that people have about how to look at a piece of frozen meat or how to look at a head of broccoli and know what to do with it and how to preserve it and how to grow it. So there's a lot of educational needs we have. And then finally people say, who are the eaters and the stewards of the food system of the future? Well, it's the next generations who are coming down the pike. It's young people. So we need to think creatively about leadership development for our young people, not only so they learn the skills of growing and preparing food, but also so that they can take leadership to understand the complex policy and economic issues that are tied to the local foods movement as well. So in the future, some of the major initiatives that we're going to have to undertake, you know, so we'll have one foot in the kitchen and the other foot in the garden, and I guess one hand, you know, waving toward the legislature, is beginning to raise public awareness. So these public forums like this are a wonderful way for you all to meet each other and begin to talk about what's the local foods movement look like in our community? What are some of the challenges I have as an eater in my own kitchen and around my family, you know, dining table? How is it that we can raise public awareness and interest in local foods? There's also a lot of research that needs to happen. What kind of business development support do folks need to make a living at producing and selling local foods? How do we get this infrastructure issues dealt with so that every single person, whether they're a farmer or an eater, or a middle person, has a way where we can navigate an infrastructure that deals with those questions of transportation costs and fair prices for farmers and people's wish for convenience and all of that. Those are some big challenges that we have. And then finally, it's what role can these retailers play? They're interested in certain ways in local foods, but it's a lot harder for them. Means instead of one vendor like Cisco, they're dealing with lots and lots of small vendors. Are they really set up to do that? What kind of support and systems do they need to develop to be more responsive to those questions? And then finally, even if we wanted to feed ourselves 10% locally produced food, who would grow it? What would we be producing? Where would we be producing it? How do we figure all that stuff out? So there's a lot of kind of, instead of just groping our way through and by hook or by crook, which is a lot of what's happening in the local foods movement, how do we begin to systematically analyze our needs and begin to figure out what stuff needs to be produced, and then how do we pull that off? What are the policy incentives we need for growers? How do we get people on the land or transitioning from one kind of operation to another? How do we help families who have to make 7 stops to get their local foods after a long work day? How do we deal with the family well-being dimension of that whole issue as well? So there's a lot of Minnesota players, and a bunch of you are in the room. I know at least a few of you in one way or another. For many years, the nonprofits, like Land Stewardship Project, have been providing the leadership in Minnesota. There's been the individual growers providing leaderships, and then nonprofits like the Sustainable Farming Association, Land Stewardship Project, Renewing the Countryside, Minnesota Food Association, a number of organizations across the state, and they've done everything from providing cultural development, so agritourism, cookbooks and events on local foods, new farmer training, policy initiatives at the state and national level, building linkages between restaurants and local farmers, and thinking through this question of farm to school. So there's been a lot of activity in the nonprofit sector, and the U of M has kind of bumped along as it's gone, providing in certain places support and programming for small local food production, while they also help and support and sustain sectors those sectors D and E. Then there's also been some state agencies in the mix, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, some other organizations. They provide grants and training programs, resources, that kind of thing. So you've had these players in the movement, but with the visioning and the leadership primarily coming from the nonprofit community and from individual community members and citizens who just really care and want to reshape what our food system looks like. So along comes the University of Minnesota, which is what I collect my paycheck from. And so what is the University of Minnesota currently doing to help support the local foods movement? They're figuring out how to extend the season by low-cost, what they call high tunnels that they can grow produce in and extend the growing season. Thinking through some of these options with supply chains. How do we develop co-ops like Organic Valley that could do some of this work? How do we create varieties of produce that are winter hardy? And then all this extension education. We talked about all these processing and preparation and skills and life tools needs that people have, as well as farm management questions. And so extension plays a key role that way. And then finally, the usual land-grant research. With increasing, I would say the sort of research agenda is widening a bit in favor of local foods. It's sort of been squashed over the last many years, but they're beginning to get a bit more attention and play thanks to the activism and advocacy of a lot of nonprofit organizations. So it's really been the citizens that have been pushing the land grant to make sure that this is on their agenda. Organic training and research, and then finally a lot of research and education on soil, water, and air quality.